Scholastic Audio presents 2 Degrees by Alan Gratz, read by Sophie Oda, Adam Sanders, and Al-Marie Guerra. The Sierra Nevada, California, Part 1. Red flag warning. Dad, look! A wildfire! Akira Christensen cried. She pointed down the mountain trail where a thin gray wisp of smoke rose from the trees in the valley. Akira's father rode just ahead of her on a black Frisian horse named Elwood. Akira was riding Dodger, her chestnut gelding quarter horse. Dodger had been the first one to sense the fire below, stopping and turning his ears toward the smoke to let Akira know there was trouble. Akira's father pulled to a stop and glanced over his shoulder. A first-generation Norwegian-American, Lars Christensen looked like a real-life Paul Bunyan, complete with blue jeans, a red plaid shirt, and a bushy brown beard. "Don't worry about it," he told Akira. "I'm sure it's nothing." Akira frowned. She'd checked the fire conditions before setting out on their ride that morning. The National Weather Service had issued a red flag warning for the Sierra Nevada range today, as they did almost every other day in the fall. A red flag warning meant warm temperatures, dry conditions, and strong winds, which all added up to the possibility of a forest fire. How could smoke in the foothills not be a problem? Akira looked at the ground, where brittle leaves and pine needles were ready and waiting to burn. "Shouldn't we at least let Cal Fire know?" she asked. "A little fire is good for a forest," her dad told her. "It gets rid of all the dry stuff before too much of it builds up and burns out of control." "Yeah, but it seems like there aren't any little fires anymore," Akira thought. Not since the temperature of the earth had risen nearly 2 degrees, and the hotter air and longer droughts had sucked the moisture out of everything, making California a tinderbox. Now almost every fire was a megafire that burned up half the state. And it was all thanks to human-caused climate change. Akira had learned about it in school last year, and it had scared her. But when she'd come home and told her family what she'd learned, her dad said the same thing then that he said now. "Nature can take care of itself." He clicked his tongue for Elwood to walk on, clearly done with the subject. Akira shook her head. Her dad had seen all the same changes in the Sierra Nevada that she had in the past few years. Bigger, more frequent, more destructive wildfires. Smoke warnings that caused her to stay home and miss school. Drought conditions that had made their well run dry. But she knew better than to say the words climate change around her dad. All he would do was challenge her on it, and Akira didn't have the energy for that. Her father got energy from engaging with other people. It recharged him to be social. Akira was the opposite. She liked people, but being on all the time drained her. After a week of the normal chaos of school and family, she needed these peaceful, restorative Saturday morning rides with Dodger. And arguing about climate change was definitely not peaceful. Akira looked over her shoulder at the smoke and sighed. Then she gave Dodger a pat on his withers to let him know she'd gotten his message. "Thanks, Dodger. Everything's okay," she told him. "I hope," she added silently. King Sequoia. It was October, and the hillsides were awash in oranges and yellows and reds and greens. Akira loved this time of year, when the air was crisp and cool and smelled like cedar and Douglas fir. There were a few dark clouds in the sky, but Akira knew it wasn't going to rain. It never rained anymore. Akira closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting Dodger have the reins. He and Elwood carried Akira and her father up into a tall canopy of ponderosa pines, where bear clover and white alder grew among granite boulders. The horses climbed higher, to the top of the mountain, and at last Akira and her dad came to the place they'd been headed all along. A hush fell over Akira like she'd entered a church, and her skin tingled.
Do behold the king in his glory, King Sequoia,"
Akira's father whispered, quoting a line from the naturalist John Muir. All around Akira and her dad were dozens of giant sequoias, some of the biggest trees on the planet. The largest sequoia here was 12 feet wide, and it stretched so high up into the sky, Akira had to crane her neck back to see the top of it. Full-grown giant sequoias like these were called monarchs because they were the kings and queens of trees. Some of them were over 2,000 years old. Akira and her dad shared a smile. They both loved this place. Up here, Akira felt like she was outside of time, like the rest of the world didn't exist. This grove was Akira's escape, her sanctuary. Akira hopped off Dodger and walked deeper into the grove while her horse grazed. This is what it must feel like to be an ant among elephants, Akira thought. The giant sequoias made her feel small and insignificant, but in a good way. They reminded her that she wasn't the center of the universe, that there were things that were far older and bigger than she was. Her father got down from Elwood.
"Oh no,"
he whispered theatrically.
"What will happen if your wildfire makes it all the way up here?"
Akira scowled. She knew as well as her dad did that giant sequoias were adapted to withstand wildfires. Their bark was 2 feet thick, and their shaggy evergreen leaves were high up, where forest fires couldn't reach them. These trees even needed wildfires to reproduce. Their seed cones only opened up when exposed to extreme heat. A wildfire was never going to burn these trees down, and her father knew it. He was baiting her, trying to get her to argue with him about climate change. Akira huffed and turned away. Why did her dad have to ruin this? These rides into the mountains were when Akira felt closest to her father. He was the one who'd taught her the names of all the plants and animals in the forest, and all the facts about giant sequoias, who'd taught her how to recharge her batteries in nature. How could her father be wrong about climate change, but right about everything else? Akira shook her head. She wasn't going to bite. She wasn't going to argue. This was her day. Her time away from everything, in her favorite place in the whole world, and she wasn't going to let anybody spoil it. "Whoa, cool!" a girl's voice shouted behind her, and Akira jumped. Trespassers. Akira turned around. The girl who'd intruded on her sanctuary looked to be about 13, like Akira. She had short raven black hair and light brown skin, just like the man who was walking beside her. Father and daughter, Akira guessed. "And there are horses, too!" the girl added, running for Dodger and Elwood. Halfway there, she saw Akira and stopped. "Oh, hi. Sorry."
"Hey there,"
Akira's dad said to the newcomers.
"I'm Lars, and this is Akira. Daniel and Sue," the other dad said.
He and his daughter had a bit of an accent, but Akira couldn't place it.
"Where are you from?"
Akira's dad asked. Akira groaned inwardly. Her dad loved chatting with random people. He talked to everybody from drive-thru attendants to parents in the pickup line after school. That was embarrassing enough, but now his friendliness was going to encourage these strangers to stick around.
"We drove up from Fresno,"
the man said.
"Parked in the lot on the other side of the mountain and hiked up. How about you?" "We live close. Rode up from the other side," Akira's dad said. "My wife and younger daughter are back home."
"Can I pet your horse?" Sue asked Akira as their dads made small talk. "Sure, I guess," Akira said, swallowing her frustration. Why did this girl and her dad have to be here now? They were trespassing on her refuge. At least Sue knew enough to rub Dodger's neck. not pet his head like a dog. And Dodger seemed to like her, giving Sue a nudge with his nose that made her giggle. Dodger was a good judge of character, and that made Akira relax a little. "These giant trees are incredible," Sue said, her voice quieting. Maybe she was starting to feel some of the grove's magic, too. "Yeah. Is this your first time seeing them?" Akira asked, making an effort to be sociable. It wasn't easy for her. If she was honest, Dodger was her best friend, at least since Patience had moved back to Florida. Sue nodded. "We just moved here last year." "I grew up here," Akira told her. "My dad's been bringing me to see the sequoias since I was little." "He's your dad?" Sue asked, then immediately blushed. "I'm sorry. It's just..." Akira waved it away. She got that all the time. She didn't look entirely like either of her parents, sharing her dad's broad shoulders and high cheekbones, and her Japanese-American mother's straight black hair and brown eyes. "We were a little worried to move to California, what with all the wildfires you've been having," Akira heard Sue's dad say, and alarm bells went off in her head. She took a step toward the two dads, trying to think of something she could say to change the subject, but it was too late. "You know, because of climate change," Daniel added. Akira froze. "Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no," she thought. He said the words. Akira's dad laughed. "There's no such thing as climate change," he told Sue's dad. "I mean, the Earth goes through hot and cold cycles, but humans don't have anything to do with that." Daniel looked taken aback. "You're kidding, right? You don't think the huge amounts of greenhouse gases we're releasing into the air by burning fossil fuels has anything to do with the fact that the Earth keeps getting hotter?" Akira and Sue shared a worried glance, anticipating the coming storm. Even Dodger's ears flicked toward the two men. "The Earth is a huge ecosystem," Akira's dad said, like he was explaining it to a dummy. "We're just one tiny part of it." "Dad," Akira started, but her father ignored her. Dodger danced nervously, sensing her anxiety. Their beautiful, perfect morning was going up in smoke. "All those gases trap the heat in our atmosphere," Sue's dad said, "which causes droughts and melts the ice caps and raises the sea level. Climate change is real, and we're causing it, which means we have a responsibility to do something about it." "Do you hear yourself?" said Akira's dad. "Look at these trees. How can you stand among these giants and think anything we do could change anything? The idea that we caused climate change, or could stop it if we wanted to, is the height of arrogance." "I'll tell you what's arrogant," Daniel said, but he never got to finish. "Fire!" Sue screamed, making them all jump. "There's a wildfire down the other side of the mountain!" Akira looked back the way she and her father had come, and gasped. The little trickle of smoke they'd seen a short while ago had turned into a huge, raging wildfire. The fire was growing fast, eating up the forest with impossible speed. And it was headed right for them. "We have to get back to the car, now!" Daniel cried. "You'll never make it on foot. Not with how fast that fire's moving," Akira's dad said, their argument forgotten in their panic. "Get on the horses. We'll take you to the parking lot." Akira grabbed her father's arm. "But Dad, that's the opposite direction of our house." "We'll drop them off, then go around the long way," he told her. "We'll be all right, but we have to get these people to safety. Now hurry, go!" A fire named Morris. The horses moved at a quick canter down the trail, Akira's dad rode on Elwood with Sue, and Akira was on Dodger, with Daniel sitting behind her. Dodger's ears kept flicking forward and back, and his muscles and gait were stiff. Was he picking up on Akira's fear and the urgency of their run through the woods, or was he sensing something more? How close was the fire behind them? Akira pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. "What's that?" Daniel asked, looking over her shoulder. "Fire tracker app," Akira told him. "Shows you where fires are in real time." A map of the area loaded, and seconds later Akira watched as a big red blob appeared, covering everything behind them. She zoomed out, but the red blob kept going, and going, and going. Akira sucked in her breath. "That's impossible," she whispered. "How bad is it?" Akira's dad called, glancing back at her. "Bad!" Akira said. It had been less than half an hour since she'd first seen that trickle of smoke. Now the fire covered a huge part of the map, beyond the main road around the mountain. The road Sue and her dad would have to take to get out of here. Worse, the big red blob already had a label on it. "They're calling it the Morris Fire," Akira said. She and her father shared a worried look. They both knew what it meant when Cal Fire gave a wildfire a name. That meant it was a big one. As Akira watched, the app updated, and the leading edge of the fire jumped closer to the road. "It's moving so fast!" Akira cried. "We're going to be all right," her dad called back. "We're almost to the parking lot." Akira could feel Daniel trembling behind her on the horse. Akira was frightened too. More frightened than she'd ever been in her whole life. She'd seen fires like this on the news, breathed in their smoke from miles away, but she'd never been this close to one. When wildfires got big, when the wind whipped them up and they grew quickly out of control, that's when they were really dangerous. That's when they ate up houses and towns and hundreds of thousands of acres of forest. And people. Akira tried to tamp down the panic rising inside her. Was that smoke she was smelling in the air? Or was it her imagination? And was it getting darker? Or was that just a cloud passing by above the trees? We should have called somebody when we first saw the smoke, Akira thought. We should have tried to do something about it. Now it was too late. The horses burst from the wooded trail into a small gravel parking lot. There was only one car there, a sleek-looking four-door hybrid. Very different from the heavy-duty, gas-guzzling pickup truck Akira's dad drove. "That's our car!" Sue cried. Akira pulled Dodger to a stop. Sue's dad slid off the horse and went to help Sue dismount from Elwood. Dodger whinnied and danced around nervously under Akira, and she put a hand on his withers to calm him. "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" Akira checked the fire tracker app again and blinked. The blue dot that marked her location was showing her inside the fire. "What?" Akira cried, and as she looked up, she saw the first tongues of orange flame licking the trees along the road. The fire was here. Burning questions. "Dad!" Akira cried. She pointed to the edge of the parking lot, where trees were igniting like matchsticks. "No," her dad said, spinning around on Elwood. "No, no, no, no!" Akira could feel Dodger wanting to bolt, and she fought to rein him under control. Daniel hugged Sue close. "What do we do? Where do we go?" he asked. The little gravel lot was too small to protect them. Akira could see that. If they stayed where they were, the fire would engulf them. Akira's dad hopped off Elwood. "Into the car," he told everyone. "Now! Quickly! We have to drive through it!" "Drive through it?" Daniel cried. "Better than staying here as it sweeps over us," Akira's dad said.
The asphalt will act as a natural fire break. See? It's the trees and brush that are on fire, not the road. Her dad was right. The fire was spreading through the forest, but not onto the pavement. Driving was the only way out. For them. But what about the horses? Akira asked. She put a hand on Dodger's neck again. Hi-ya! Her dad yelled. He slapped Elwood on the rump, and the black Frisian took off into the woods, away from the fire. The horses are better off on their own, he told Akira. What? No! Akira cried. She jerked away, and Dodger backed away with her. Akira, get down off the horse. We have to go, her dad said. Daniel and Sue were already in their car. Burning orange embers swept past Akira on the wind, hitting the car, the gravel, the dry grass and pine needles behind her. Little fires were springing up everywhere, even on the gravel. Dodger snorted and capered. Tears streamed down Akira's face. He'll burn up in the fire! So will Elwood! The horses are faster than us. They can outrun the fire, her dad told her. Akira knew her dad was right. Horses spooked easy. Open an umbrella near them and they would gallop halfway across a meadow and stand there giving the umbrella the stink eye. Elwood was already long gone, and he and Dodger could find their way home in a fog, with or without Akira or her dad there to guide them. But to just leave Dodger behind... We have to go! Daniel yelled from inside the car. The fire was spreading around the edges of the parking lot. Akira's dad grabbed her and lifted her off Dodger, and she sobbed guiltily. No! Dodger! She cried, reaching out for him, pleading silently for him to be all right, to return home to her safe and sound. Hi-ya! Her father cried. He gave Dodger a slap on the backside, and Akira watched her best friend run away into the woods. Akira's dad hustled her into the back seat of the car next to Sue, then ran to the passenger side and hopped in next to Daniel. Go! Go! Akira's dad cried. Daniel hit the accelerator. The hybrid's tires spun on the gravel, and then the car launched forward, throwing Akira back in her seat as they drove straight into the heart of the inferno. Into the fire. The top of a burning tree fell onto the road in front of the car, and Akira ducked in fear as Daniel plowed over it. Woomph! Crunch! The little car rocked. Akira's dad yelped and threw a hand out to brace himself on the dashboard. Sue screamed. Akira fell on the floor of the car. Seat belts! Daniel roared. Akira scrambled back up. As she and Sue bent over to latch their seatbelts, Akira noticed 3 shiny pinkish lines on the left side of Sue's forehead. They were all half an inch long and ran parallel to each other before disappearing into the roots of Sue's dark hair. Scars, Akira realized with a start. But from what? The car bumped and thumped over more debris in the road, and Akira's eyes were drawn back to the hellscape outside her window. Even though it was still morning, the world looked black as night. The only light came from the trees on either side of the road. They glowed yellow-orange, burning like someone had dumped gasoline on them and then lit them up with a flamethrower. The car passed by a hillside that was a sea of flames, so bright Akira had to look away. Sweat coated her forehead and ran down her back. Her dad tried turning on the AC, but all that did was blast smoke into the car, and he quickly turned it off. Daniel's phone auto-connected to the car stereo, and a pop song Akira liked started playing. She blinked at the absurdity of it and glanced at Sue, who looked as stunned as she was. They had just met, and here they were riding together through a wildfire as if they were heading off to see a movie. Turn on the radio, Akira's dad said. See if you can get any emergency information.
Daniel mashed buttons on the big screen on the dashboard.
Sue, how do you get the radio on this thing?
I don't know, said Sue.
Forget it. Just stay focused on the road,
Akira's dad said.
I'll call home.
Home. Akira's heart thumped a steady canter in her chest. Were her mom and little sister Hildy okay? Akira checked the Fire app, but it hadn't updated since the parking lot. The red blob marking the wildfire was a long way off from her house, but what if the winds changed? And the flames were moving so quickly. Akira thought of Dodger and Elwood. Had the fire caught up to them? A black hole of guilt ate her up from inside, and she bent double against the pain. How could she have let Dodger go? He was her everything. He'd been her horse since they were both 10 years old. She fed him and talked to him every morning and night, took him out on the trails around their house, mucked out his stall, brushed and combed his mane and tail, cleaned and conditioned his leather saddle, his bridle, his halter. Oh, Dodger! If only they'd headed home at the first sign of the wildfire. If only they hadn't taken Sue and her dad back down to the parking lot. A burning ember hit the windshield and burst into 1,000 bright sparks, and Akira jumped. More embers rattled on the roof like hail.
I can't get through to your mother,
Akira's dad said, lowering his phone. Sue looked at Akira with worried eyes, and Akira felt sick all over again. I'm sure she's all right, Sue told her. Akira hoped so. Sue was lucky at least. Her own mother was down in Fresno, far away from the fire. Akira texted her mom. We're in a stranger's car, trying to drive through the fire. Watch for Dodger and Elwood. We sent them ahead. Are you and Hildy okay? She hit send and waited, watching for the little dots that would show her mother was writing back. The dots didn't come, and Akira wilted. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locked on the road ahead. It's too much! I can't see! The whole canyon's a death trap! He said, his voice shaking. He sniffed, and Akira realized Daniel was crying. Akira pulled back, more scared of hearing a grown-up cry than the world of fire outside.
It's okay. We're going to be okay, Akira's dad told him.
His own voice was strained and nervous.
Just keep driving slow and steady. You're doing great.
Daniel drove intently, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The main road acted as a natural fire break, just as Akira's dad had said it would. But the flames were so high they scaled the pine trees and rode the wind across to the other side, creating a kind of fire tunnel for the little car. Oaks and maples lit up like Christmas trees, their burning leaves glowing like strands of orange bulbs. Sometimes an entire tree trunk was on fire, the whole thing outlined in bright orange. Akira had never seen anything like it. They came around a curve in the mountain road, and Daniel hit the brakes, throwing them all against their seatbelts. A dark shadow loomed ahead of them, blocking their way. Daniel inched closer to the thing in the smoke, and at last Akira was able to make out what it was. It was a car, half on and half off the road. Its front end was stuck in a ditch, and its back end hung in the air. And it was on fire. A metal car was on fire. The car in the ditch. Do you think somebody's in there? Sue asked, giving voice to what everyone else was thinking. Akira squinted, but she couldn't see inside the burning car. Daniel honked his horn. Hey! He yelled, even though there was no way anybody in the other car could have heard him. Hey! If you're in there, get out! Nobody honked back, and nobody got out of the burning car. Akira shuddered, imagining what it would be like to be trapped in there, burning alive. "What do we do?" Daniel asked. Akira's dad suddenly threw his car door open and jumped out. "Dad! No!" Akira cried. Akira watched with her heart in her throat as her father ran through the thick brown smoke toward the burning car. As her father bent to peer inside the windows, Akira felt sweat beading up on her forehead. It was getting hotter in Sue's car. And if the car in the ditch had caught on fire... Akira's dad hurried back to their car and threw himself into the passenger seat, hacking and coughing and covered in sweat. "Dad, are you all right?" Akira cried, reaching out for him. "Was there someone inside?" Sue asked. Akira's dad shook his head and waved Daniel forward. "Nobody there," he croaked. "I'm okay. Go." Daniel hit the accelerator, and they swerved around the burning car. Akira worried about her father as he continued to cough, but there was nothing she could do. She checked her phone, and her heart leapt when she saw she had a text from her mom. "We're okay. Stay with your father and let us know when you're safe." Heart emoji. "Mom just texted me," Akira announced. "She and Hildy are okay." Akira's dad reached his hand back, and Akira squeezed it. What neither of them said was that they weren't okay, and neither was anybody else in the car. Everybody was quiet as Daniel drove on. Glowing embers drifted through the air, and Morris's flames were almost purple in the smoke. A burning house looked to Akira like a glowing skull, its broken windows hollow like eye sockets, its exterior walls black against the bright orange fire that filled it. It felt like they were driving through a movie about the end of the world. How big is Morris now? Akira wondered. She tried her fire tracker app again, but it still wasn't updating. "Please just let us get through the fire," Akira whispered. And then, as if in answer to her prayer, the little car rounded a turn, and the flames were completely gone. There was still smoke all around, but the road had curved out of the path of the fire. They all let out gasps of relief, and Daniel turned to smile reassuringly at Sue. "I told you everything was going to be all right," Akira's dad said, and Akira laughed. They were free from the fire. They were going to make it after all. And then another car came flying out of a driveway next to them and smashed into the side of their car.
The Tundra Buggy. A big male polar bear stood up on his hind legs and put its front paws on the Tundra Buggy with a thump, and the tourists sitting inside jumped back and gasped. Standing behind them in the aisle, 13-year-old Owen Mackenzie smiled and rubbed his hands together. He was definitely going to get good tips on this trip. "They don't call Churchill the polar bear capital of the world for nothing, folks," Owen said. The tourists shook off their surprise and leaned in to ooh and ah and take pictures of the polar bear, and Owen's dad turned around in the driver's seat and gave Owen a quiet fist bump. Owen's parents were the owners and operators of Tundra Treks, a company that took people to see polar bears in the frozen wilderness outside Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill was a tiny town in northeast Canada, 1,000 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle, on the western side of Hudson Bay. Polar bears mostly ate seals, but could only catch them out on the ice that formed when the ocean froze over in the winter. When spring came and the sea ice melted, the polar bears came back on land and spent the whole summer going hungry. Then, every October, 1,000 polar bears made their way to the place where the sea ice reformed first, Churchill, Manitoba. As soon as the bay froze over, the bears headed out to hunt seals again and began their annual migration north. But for one glorious month, lots of chilling polar bears meant lots of tourists, which meant lots of money for families like Owen's. The polar bear outside the Tundra Buggy stretched his nose up to sniff one of the windows, and the tourists laughed with delight. Most male polar bears are about 2.5 meters long and weigh around 450 kilos, Owen said, reciting facts from his memorized script. That's 9 feet tall and 1,000 pounds for you folks from the U.S. Owen had learned to explain things in ways that people from lots of different places could understand. Every year, 10,000 tourists visited Churchill from all over the world. Just today, he'd heard American English, British English, German, Spanish, and Korean. Owen had been working as a tour guide for his parents since he was 10. He was white, with blonde hair like his dad, and blue eyes like his mom. He'd always been comfortable around adults, and he loved any chance he could get to grab a microphone and be the center of attention, which made him a natural as the tour guide on his family's Tundra buggy. Tundra buggies looked like huge white buses on black monster truck tires. The big tires helped protect the fragile permafrost below and kept the tourists up high, out of the reach of curious polar bears. Benches inside the Tundra buggy could hold up to 40 people, but this late in the season, there were only about 20 people on Owen's tour. "Can we pet the polar bears?" one of the passengers asked. He was a boy around Owen's age with light brown skin, black hair, and arching eyebrows that made him look continually skeptical. "No," Owen said, answering for everyone. "Polar bears are the largest land predators on Earth. Even though they look like big, cute dogs to them, you look like a big hot dog with mustard and relish." The tourists laughed again. Owen loved a responsive group like this one. "Thankfully, polar bears prefer to eat seals," he went on, "but they've been known to attack humans, and they're sneaky about it. Everybody in Churchill leaves their houses and cars unlocked this time of year, just in case we meet a polar bear while we're out and have to duck inside some place to get away." "Does that often happen?" a lady with a German accent asked, her eyes big at the thought. "Have you ever encountered a polar bear in town?" "Not me personally," Owen told her, "but bears come into Churchill all the time. A few years ago, a girl from my school was attacked on Halloween night." The crowd gasped. "It's okay. She survived," Owen said quickly. Another time, a man in town came out of the shower and was drying off when he looked up and saw a polar bear peeking through the window, he said, and everyone laughed again. "Sometimes, polar bears bust right into houses looking for food," Owen added. "Back when I was a kid," Owen's dad said from the driver's seat, "the Department of Natural Resources shot any bears that came into town. Now we tranquilize them and send them to polar bear jail, where they stay until the sea ice forms, and they're airlifted out by helicopter and released in the wild." The scientific name for polar bears is Ursus maritimus, which means sea bear, Owen said, shifting back to his tour guide script. "That's because polar bears are such great swimmers." "Wait, can we swim with the polar bears?" the dark-haired kid from before interrupted. Owen took a deep breath. "No," he said. "Again, the polar bear would eat you. Besides, the water around here is freezing this time of year. You'd probably die of hypothermia first." The annoying kid shrugged. "If I was trying to get away from a polar bear, I would just dig a hole in the snow and hide where the bear couldn't see me," he said. "That is also a bad idea," said Owen. He turned to the rest of the group. "Maybe you've heard the old saying about bears. If it's brown, lie down. If it's black, fight back. If it's white, say good night." "Because you're going to go to sleep with the bears?" the annoying kid asked. "No," Owen said, trying to keep his cool. "Because you're going to be dead. Polar bears are big, fast, strong, and smart. And you can't hide from them. Polar bears can smell seals miles away through 2 feet of ice. If you do have the misfortune to come face to face with a polar bear, don't run and don't play dead. And never, ever turn your back on a polar bear. Just back away slowly, making as much noise as you can, and maybe you'll survive." The bear outside moved away from the Tundra buggy, and Owen's dad started the engine again. "Looks like it's time to head back in," Owen said, and everyone groaned. "We were hoping to see a mother and her cubs," a Canadian woman said as they rolled back into town. Owen smiled. Cubs were always a major attraction, but it was the end of the season and most of the bears were out on the ice already. "Sorry. Cubs are super cute. We do see them sometimes, but mama bears are very protective of their cubs. You do not want to come between a cub and its mother. Mama bear will wreck you," Owen said, getting a laugh. "What about climate change?" A man with a Scandinavian accent asked. I read that the warmer temperatures mean there's less ice for polar bears to live on. That's true, Owen told everyone. The sea ice is melting earlier and coming later every year. But hey, that means we get more time with the polar bears, he added brightly. The Tundra buggy pulled into its big parking lot on the outskirts of Churchill. Owen went down the steps first and stood by the exit as the tourists came out. He thanked each of them for coming and graciously accepted their compliments and tips. When everyone was gone, the kid who'd asked all the annoying questions came down the steps and stood near Owen, staring at him quietly. Owen squinted at him, waiting long moments for him to say or do something. They both broke down in laughter at the same time. Dude, seriously? Owen cried. Can we pet the polar bears? Can we swim with the polar bears? George Gruyere was laughing so hard he had to hold his stomach. George had been Owen's best friend since they shared crayons with each other on the first day of kindergarten. They had been pretending not to know each other on the tour for laughs. George was Mushkegowuk. The Mushkegowuk were an indigenous people sometimes referred to as the Swampy Cree and now registered with the Canadian government as the York Factory First Nation. George's ancestors had lived in this part of the world for millennia and had been the ones to greet the first French trappers who ventured north from Montreal in the 1600s. Owen's father came out of the tundra buggy and chuckled. George, I almost lost it when you said you just dig a hole to hide from a polar bear, he said. He put a hand on Owen's head. Good job today, kiddo. You guys going out to the cabin now that you have the weekend off? Owen nodded. Ordinarily, this was the weekend the weather lady flew in from the States for her annual Arctic tour, renting out the whole tundra buggy for herself and her crew. She did wild stunts like crawling inside polar bear dens and lighting ponds on fire, which was always exciting. But her flight had been canceled because of bad weather or something. Owen was bummed, but glad to have the whole weekend to spend at George's family's ice fishing cabin instead. I just gotta get my bag from Mom, Owen said, darting off across the parking lot. Owen's dad grabbed him by the shoulder and hauled him back, saving Owen from being run over by one of the tourists' rental cars that was driving away. Owen, his dad scolded him. I know there aren't tons of cars in Churchill, but you still have to pay attention. Right, Owen called, breaking away. Sorry. Owen banged inside the office of Tundra Treks, and his mom looked up at him with a smile from behind the counter. The tourists were raving about you, she told him. They're going to go home and tell all their friends about Tundra Treks. Sweet, Owen said, running for his bag. I packed you and George some brownies, Owen's mom said. Aw, yes, Owen said. Thanks, Mom. You have everything you need? Phone, flares, air horn, bear spray, cracker shells? Yeah, Owen said. His mom always worried, but most of the polar bears were already out on the sea ice, and he and George had been out to the cabin by themselves plenty of times before. He was ready to run, but his mother curled a finger at him, and he slunk over to her. Owen, remember, she said, tapping his forehead. You have to pay attention and think. I know. Dad already told me. I mean it, she said. You're really good at focusing on what you're interested in, but really bad at noticing that you're about to step into an ice hole. Heh, ice hole, Owen said. Owen's mom narrowed her eyes. That is exactly what I'm talking about, young man. Think big picture. Big ice hole? Owen, his mother warned. Okay, Owen said, pulling away. Big picture. I got it. Have fun, his mom called as he ran outside. And watch out for polar bears! Ice holes. Owen and George powered through the newly fallen snow on George's snowmobile. George drove, and Owen sat behind him. It was cool that George had a snowmobile they could use, but Owen was trying to save up to buy his own. Then he wouldn't have to ride shotgun anymore. Mom told me to look out for ice holes, Owen told George, the wind clipping his words. You are an ice hole, George said back, and Owen laughed. George throttled down to steer around a slow SUV that didn't know how to drive in the snow or didn't know where it was going, or both. Ugh, George said. I hate all the tourists. Tourists are good, Owen told him. Tourists are money. Owen smiled and waved at the tourists in the SUV as they passed, and they happily waved back. In a few weeks, the last of the tourists would be gone, along with a lot of the tour guides and workers who only came to town for polar bear season. Owen loved both times of the year. Quiet season was great, because then the tiny town would be theirs and theirs alone. But he loved the excitement and influx of new people that came with the tourist season too. And he loved the polar bears, of course. A blue pickup truck with flashing yellow lights blocked off the road they were taking out of town, and George slowed the snowmobile again. "Oh, now this?" he moaned. The truck belonged to the Manitoba Department of Natural Resources, what everybody called the DNR. The DNR were in charge of running off polar bears that came into town. Someone in a second DNR truck was doing that right now, firing cracker shells into the air from a shotgun as they chased a big dirty polar bear back to the tundra. Pacow! 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 Cracker shells weren't real bullets. They just made a lot of noise, which tended to scare off most polar bears. Most, but not all. Every year, the DNR ended up killing 1 or 2 polar bears that attacked a person or killed someone's dog. "Gotta be one of the last bears of the season," Owen said. "I'm surprised he's not out on the ice yet." "I know the feeling," said George. "We're never going to get to the ice fishing cabin." Tourists always wanted to see the DNR chase polar bears, but Owen and George had both seen it happen so many times they didn't need to stay and watch. George revved the snowmobile and turned to find another way out of town. Mac and cheese. George finally found a clear road, and they zoomed past the big Inukshuk that stood beside the broad, flat lake right outside Churchill. Inukshuk was an Inuit word for a tall stack of stones in the shape of a person. Inukshuks marked things like travel routes, or good places to fish or camp, or special places people believed were close to the spirits. The city of Churchill had put this Inukshuk up for tourists to take pictures with. A family was there now, posing for a selfie, and Owen gave them a friendly wave. George opened up the throttle on the snowmobile, and Owen closed his eyes and enjoyed the mix of warm sun and cold air. Like George, he wore colorful snow goggles, a knitted ski mask, a dark, heavy parka, and insulated boots and wool mittens. They both wore thick wool socks and thermal underwear too, even though it wasn't the darkest, coldest part of winter yet. That came in January and February, when the temperature dropped to around negative 56 degrees Celsius, and the sun was only up for 6 hours a day. Now it was only minus 16 degrees Celsius, and they had plenty of daylight to make it to the fishing cabin before sundown. "Your mom sent you with brownies?" George asked, his voice whipping by on the wind. "Is Churchill full of ice holes?" Owen called back. George nodded and raised his fist in salute. Owen's mom's brownies were legendary among the kids in town, made with caramel, nuts, and crushed pretzels. They zoomed east, running parallel to the shore of Hudson Bay. From the back of the snowmobile, Owen could see white chunks of ice floating on the turquoise blue water. That was enough for the polar bears to head out and start hunting. Soon, the chunks would grow and pile up and form one solid mass that would cover the bay for months, making it impassable for ships and shutting down the port of Churchill for the season. The port was where George's dad worked. Owen felt a gust of warmer air and frowned. Was it his imagination, or had that come in off the freezing bay? "I wish we could see the new Marvel movie this weekend," said George. Owen wanted to see it too, but he was used to waiting. "The Polar Cinema will get it in a month," he said. The Polar Cinema was Churchill's lone movie house, a single-screen theater in the town center complex that showed new movies about a month after they came out everywhere else. "I'm just saying it would be nice if we lived someplace where the closest first-run movie theater wasn't 17 hours away by train," George groused. Owen frowned behind his friend. It was true. You had to use a train, a plane, or a ship to get anything in or out of Churchill. Even their cars and trucks had to be imported. But Owen liked that isolation. He liked that this was their little corner of the world, disconnected from everything else. And he'd thought George did too. "First it's the tourists, now it's the movie theater. You sound like your brother," Owen said. George's brother was 16 and couldn't wait to get out of town. "Why are you so down on Churchill all of a sudden?" Owen asked. "How are you not down on Churchill?" George asked. "Are you kidding? It's a kid's dream up here," Owen argued. "We get to ride wherever we want on snowmobiles, go ice fishing, see polar bears. We can go kayaking with beluga whales in the summer and see the northern lights all year long. There's a movie theater and a library and a bowling alley and a pool in the town center and—" "Maybe I just want to live in a place where I don't have to put on 10 layers of clothes to go outside in the winter," said George. "Where the mosquitoes aren't so thick in the summer they can drain a pint of blood from a dog in a day. Where there are more than 7 girls our age, and we haven't known them all since we were in kindergarten." Or boys, for that matter, thought Owen. Was that what was eating George? The small dating pool? Owen hadn't thought much about it, but with only 900 year-rounders in town, everybody did know everybody else here. There were only 15 kids in the 8th grade at Duke of Marlborough School, and 200 kids total from kindergarten up through grade 12. Churchill was a town with more polar bears than people. "I'm just saying that maybe there's more to life than what you can get in Churchill, Manitoba," George said. Owen was sad to hear his friend say that. He could sense that George didn't want to talk about it anymore, though, so Owen let it go. Neither of them said a word as they passed Miss Piggy, the graffitied wreckage of the old cargo plane that had crashed trying to fly out of Churchill back in the 1970s. They were still quiet half an hour later when they passed the SS Ithaca, the big, rusted and broken-down ship out in the bay that had run aground in a storm in the 1960s and been stuck there ever since. The Ithaca was the landmark for where to turn inland toward the Gruyères fishing cabin, and George silently steered them south away from the bay. The snowmobile zoomed around shallow frozen lakes and dodged clusters of smooth gray rocks that stuck up out of the white blanket of snow like icebergs on the ocean. All the while, Owen felt the silence between him and George growing. He didn't know what was up with his best friend, but he didn't want it to ruin the fun weekend they had planned. "Hey," said Owen. "Hey, George." "What?" said George. "I just thought of something," Owen said. "What?" said George. "I need to pee," Owen said. George laughed, in spite of himself, and he stopped the snowmobile near some rocks where they could both go to the bathroom with a little privacy. "Hey, George," Owen said, calling over his shoulder as he got unzipped. "I have an idea for what we can call ourselves." "You mean besides George and Owen?" George asked, trying to write a big yellow G in the snow. "Mac and Cheese," Owen called back. "You know, because my last name is Mackenzie. So, I'm Mac." "I am not the cheese," George told him. "The cheese is good," Owen argued. "You could be the big cheese, you know, like the boss." "How am I the cheese at all in this scenario?" George asked. "Because you couldn't think of anything else to go with Mac?" Owen looked back at George over his shoulder. "Dude, your last name is Gruyere. That is literally a kind of cheese. It's perfect." "Just hurry up, icehole," George told him. Owen turned back to zip up his pants and saw the cutest thing ever a few meters away. It was a tiny polar bear cub, rolling around on its back and looking up at Owen like it wanted to play. Owen's heart melted. He'd seen plenty of polar bear cubs from inside his parents' Tundra buggy, but never one this close up, and suddenly he was cooing like the sappiest tourist. As he watched, the cub grabbed its back legs with its front paws and fell sideways in the snow with a tiny thump. "Aw, George, check it out," Owen said. The cub was so freaking adorable. Suddenly, Owen's tour guide script came back to him, and he heard his own words. Cubs are super cute, but you do not want to come between a cub and its mother. Mama Bear will wreck you. Mama Bear, he thought. Where was Mama Bear? Owen spun around. George had turned to look at him and the cub, which meant George didn't see the big polar bear standing right behind him. "George!" Owen cried, but too late. Mama Bear swatted the back of George's head, and Owen's friend went down in a spray of red blood. Mama Bear. Mama Bear stood up on her back legs, and Owen had never felt so small in his entire life. She was easily 225 kilos big and 2 meters tall, and her fur was stained a yellowish white from being off the ice for so long. All except for her right front paw, which was red. Red, with George's blood. Owen reached around for the shotgun on his shoulder, but it wasn't there. His stomach sank. Because George always drove the snowmobile, Owen got to carry the shotgun. That was the deal. But Owen had been so busy clowning around to get George to lighten up that he'd forgotten to grab the shotgun from the snowmobile, which was parked behind the polar bear. Owen stood frozen in terror as Mama Bear thumped back down on all fours in the snow, less than a meter away from George's body. George wasn't moving. He didn't look like he was even breathing. Was George playing dead? Or was he really dead? Mama Bear opened her mouth wide and swung her head back and forth, low and mean, showing off her huge, sharp teeth. She reared back to lunge at George again, and Owen finally found his voice. "Hey!" he squeaked. There was no air in his lungs. He took a quick breath. "Hey, Bear!" he yelled, getting some volume behind it this time. Owen waved his arms. "Look at me! Let's go!" Mama Bear stopped mid-attack and locked in on him with a furious glare. It suddenly reminded Owen of how his mother had looked that time he and George started a fire in the microwave, trying to slow-cook baked potatoes. How could a bear look so human? Getting Mama Bear's attention had bought George a precious few seconds of not being attacked, but Owen didn't know what to do next. He had no phone or flares or air horn, no bear spray or shotgun and cracker shells. All that was back in the snowmobile. "Because I wasn't thinking," Owen berated himself. Mama Bear stepped over George's body toward Owen, and Owen instinctively took a step back. His throat was dry as ashes, but he swallowed down a gulp. "Oh crap," he thought. "Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap!" Mama Bear was coming for him next. The polar bear huffed like a dog. "Hoof, hoof." She opened her mouth wide again to show her teeth and popped her jaw. It sounded like somebody tapping a wooden spoon against a wooden bowl. Tuck, 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 tuck. Owen knew that polar bears huffed and popped their jaws to warn people off, but he'd never heard it up close like this. Never felt that deep down, icy cold certainty in his bones that a polar bear was about to charge him. But he sure felt it now. The urge to run was like one of those big hooks that came out in cartoons to yank people off stage. Owen couldn't resist it. Every centimeter of him was screaming at him to run, 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 run! And that's exactly what he did. Owen turned in his tracks and ran away from the big polar bear as hard and as fast as he could. Thump, 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 thump. Was that the sound of his boots stomping in the snow? Or was it his heart hammering in his chest? His boots, his big parka, his rasping snow pants, they all dragged at him, weighed him down. He was too slow, too slow. He heard the thumping crunch of Mama Bear's paws in the snow as she loped after him. Th-thump, th-thump, th-thump. Owen's breath blew out in great white clouds, fogging his snow goggles. He couldn't see, didn't know where he was running. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. One of Owen's boots slipped in the snow. He stumbled, slid, started to fall forward. And then something big and strong and sharp whacked his arm and sent him spinning into the snow.
The Big One. Natalie Torres sat on the edge of her couch, her eyes glued to the television, and her weather journal clutched tight in her hands. Hurricane Ruben has gone back and forth between Category 4 and Category 5, the highest, most powerful category we have, Maria Martinez said on TV, pointing to the huge swirling mass of white clouds projected behind her. Everybody in Miami knew Maria Martinez, the chief meteorologist for one of the local news channels. They may not have watched the weather forecast every night like Natalie did, but when there was a hurricane, everybody in South Florida turned to Maria for the latest. Natalie knew that Hurricane Ruben had already brushed Puerto Rico, where Natalie's mother had been born, and Natalie's father still lived, and made a devastating landfall in the Dominican Republic. After that, it had picked up strength again and swept along the top of Cuba, and now it was deciding where to go next.
Our current projection models show Reuben possibly hitting the Florida Keys and heading west, into the Gulf of Mexico, the way Katrina did in 2005 on its way to New Orleans. Maria Martinez said. Or it could round the Everglades and travel north up the west coast of Florida. And of course, there's still a strong possibility that it will make a right turn at the Bahamas and drive straight up I-95, hitting Miami and Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach and everything in between. Natalie shuddered. That was what she and everybody in Miami feared the most. The big one. The giant, mythical hurricane that would destroy the entire southeast coast of Florida. For 100 years, Maria Martinez was saying, hurricanes have hit all over South Florida except for Miami. Andrew, Wilma, Irma, they all came close and did a great deal of damage, but the last hurricane to hit Miami directly was in 1926, when only 100,000 people lived here. The Great Miami Hurricane leveled the city, killing hundreds of people and leaving tens of thousands more homeless. She paused. Now there are close to 3 million people in Miami-Dade County alone. Natalie swallowed. Back when she was in 2nd grade, everybody had thought that Hurricane Irma was going to be the big one. It wasn't. Irma ended up barely missing Miami. But it had come close. Close enough to rip Natalie's roof off while she and her mother huddled in the bathroom. Ever since Irma, Natalie had become obsessed with weather. She'd started keeping a weather journal where she wrote down the daily high and low temperatures, the cloud formations, the wind speeds, the amount of sunshine and rain. She asked for a barometer and an anemometer and a rain gauge for Christmas, and hung them outside her bedroom window. Every time she had to do a science project or write a paper in school, she did it on a different hurricane. If the weather was going to shape Natalie's life, she wanted to know everything about it. Is it the big one? Natalie's mother called, coming in the front door with groceries. They don't know yet, Natalie said, hopping up to take 2 of the bags. Natalie and her mother had the same brown skin and brown eyes, but Mama's black hair was straight and never frizzed in the Miami humidity the way Natalie's did. Natalie didn't know how her mom could wear jeans and a blouse in this heat either. The most Natalie could bear to wear were shorts and an old tank top. But Mama always looked put together, even when there was a hurricane coming. The store was pretty picked over, Mama told her. I got what I could. Natalie followed her mother to the kitchen and helped her put away the food. Everything she'd bought was canned or dry and didn't need to be cooked or refrigerated for when the power went out. She'd bought candles and matches, too, and batteries for their flashlights. Natalie glanced back at the television, where Maria Martinez was now showing a map of Miami. The city sat between the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the vast wetlands of the Everglades to the west, northwest, and south. Whether Reuben hit them directly or not, water was going to come at them from every one of those directions, plus down from the clouds and up through the porous limestone underneath the city. Maria Martinez was predicting storm surges of over 10 feet. During Irma, Natalie's house had flooded up to her knees, and that was before the roof had come off. Natalie felt a surge of panic. "We have to get everything ready," she cried. She grabbed her weather journal and showed her mom the list she'd made. "We have to fill the bathtub with water so we can flush the toilet once the power goes out. Board up the windows, take all the pictures off the walls so they don't fall and break. Put all our valuable stuff up high, out of flood range. Charge our phones." "Mija, her mother said, putting a hand on Natalie's head to calm her down. "I know you're overwhelmed, but we'll get through this together." Natalie took a deep breath and nodded, and they got to work. She and her mother were filling up water bottles in the kitchen sink so they'd have clean water to drink when Natalie's phone dinged. It was a text from her friend Shannon. "OMG, the roads are full of cars." "Are you leaving town?" Natalie texted back. No. Dad says we're safe in our building. It has a generator. He says if the power goes out, it will be like a camping trip. Eye roll emoji. Natalie shook her head. Shannon went to school here in Hialeah, their city within a city in Miami. But Shannon lived in one of the new high-rise luxury apartments in nearby Doral, not in a small single-story house like Natalie and her mom. Natalie and Shannon had met in homeroom last year at the beginning of 6th grade and had immediately bonded over their shared love of boba tea, K-pop, and extreme weather shows. Shannon texted her a picture of an interstate that skirted Miami, taken from her window. The highway looked like a parking lot. Every lane was packed bumper to bumper with cars headed north, out of the city. Look, Natalie said, showing the picture to her mom. Huh, said Mama. Must be nice to be able to get out of town. Natalie's mom worked as an administrative assistant at a doctor's office, and Natalie knew her salary wasn't that big. If they went to Tampa or Orlando and stayed in a hotel every time there was a storm, they'd be broke. When the water bottles were full, Natalie and her mother went outside to cover the windows with plywood. There was one small transom window above the front door that was too high to reach, but it hadn't broken in any previous storms. It was hot and muggy, and Natalie was panting and sweating by the time they finished hammering. The October sun was bright, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It certainly didn't look like a hurricane was coming, but something still felt off. Natalie glanced around and began to understand what was wrong. No cars drove by. No birds twittered on the power lines. There weren't even any airplanes taking off and landing at the airport just south of them. Everything was quiet and still, like Natalie and her mom were the only two people left in Hialeah. Natalie knew that wasn't true. Most of the people in her neighborhood couldn't afford to leave. They were holed up in their houses already, preparing to ride out the storm. Into the creepy silence came a loud, frantic sound. Wee-oo, 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 wee-oo. And it took Natalie a moment to realize it wasn't an alarm or a siren. It was frogs, croaking in the nearby canal. Natalie's mom pointed. Half a dozen snails were oozing up the cinder block foundation of their house, getting as high as they could. In the house next door, Natalie heard their neighbor's little chihuahua growling and barking. The animals know, Natalie thought. Something was coming. Something big. Diablito. Tia Beatriz! Mama exclaimed. The sound of Tia's dog barking made her look next door. Her windows aren't boarded up. Her son must not have come by yet. Where could he be? Tia Beatriz wasn't really Natalie's aunt, but Natalie and her mom still considered her family. The elderly woman who'd emigrated from Nicaragua years ago had been their neighbor for as long as Natalie could remember. When Natalie was younger, Tia Beatriz had babysat her after school, until her mother got home from work. Maybe her son's stuck in traffic, Natalie said, remembering Shannon's picture of the interstate. I'll bring her over to stay with us, Mama said. You keep working through the list. Natalie ran back inside and took all the photos off the walls. Natalie winning the 6th grade science fair. Mama graduating from night school. The time she and Mama had gone to Puerto Rico to see her father. Next, she put their books and electronics high up on shelves and cabinets, where they would be out of any flood. On the television, Maria Martinez said Hurricane Ruben's wind speeds were being clocked at 165 miles per hour. Natalie grabbed her weather journal and wrote that down. 165 miles per hour was high. When Irma had made landfall, Natalie remembered, its wind speed had been 130 miles per hour. Natalie heard a yip from the front door and looked up. Her mom was back with Tia Beatriz and Tia's chihuahua. Ay, Elena, I would have been fine, Tia Beatriz told Natalie's mother. I've been through hurricanes before. Not like this one, Tia, Mama said. I got her son on the phone, she told Natalie. He was sitting in his car halfway here from Homestead. I told him Tia was with us and to go home to his family. Princesa, Tia said, holding out her arms to Natalie. She had seen her only yesterday, but Natalie still gave Tia a big hug. Tia Beatrice's skin was dark brown, and her face was squished and wrinkly with age. The wrinkles radiated out from her eyes and mouth in a sort of perpetual smile, matching her personality. At their feet, Tia's tiny dog growled. Churro, you hush now, Tia scolded, but Natalie knew that was impossible. The dog's name was Churro because his fur was cinnamon-colored, like a churro, and his black snout made it look like he'd been dipped in chocolate. But Churro was anything but sweet. At least, not to Natalie. Churro bared his teeth and snapped at her, and Natalie narrowed her eyes at him. Diablito, Natalie whispered at him. Little devil. The hurricane was going to be stressful enough without having to tiptoe around Churro the whole time. Tia Beatriz waved dismissively at Maria Martinez on the television as she sat down on the couch. Shouldn't hurricane season be over already? Tia Beatriz asked. It's almost the end of October. Hurricanes are coming earlier and ending later, Natalie told her. It used to be that most hurricanes hit in August and September, but now we're getting hurricanes almost non-stop from May through November. Natalie's become something of an expert, her mother explained. Yes, I see, said Tia Beatriz. Estoy impresionada. The storms are getting bigger, too, Natalie said. And it's all because of climate change. Burning fossil fuels puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which traps the Earth's heat. Natalie started to get worked up. Years of studying the weather and diving down the rabbit hole of climate change science online had prepared her for this moment. 90% of the heat trapped in the Earth's atmosphere goes into the oceans, she went on. Hurricanes are formed over the ocean, and they feed on warm water as they move, so now the warmer water supercharges them, making hurricanes stay stronger and last longer. Okay, mija, okay, Mama said, patting her shoulder. I wish you wouldn't dwell on these things. But Mama, if we don't do something about climate change... I know, but it's too much, her mother told her. You're just making yourself upset, and there's nothing you or I can do about it. There's lots of things we can do about it, Natalie said. She grabbed her phone. I read an article online, 15 things you can do to stop global warming. Natalie, her mother said, trying to get her to slow down. We have breaking news on Hurricane Ruben, Maria Martinez said in an urgent tone, and Natalie, Mama, and Tia Beatriz looked back at the TV. The Category 5 storm has changed course and is now headed directly for the Miami metropolitan area. The National Weather Service has issued a mandatory evacuation for all of Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, Collier, and Monroe counties. Natalie felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. I'm calling it, everybody, Maria Martinez said. She swallowed hard and looked right into the camera. Our lucky streak is over. The big one is here. The party's over. The rain came down in sheets, and the lights in Natalie's house flickered. She, Mama, and Tia Beatriz sat together on the couch, listening to the oscillating roar of the storm outside. Low, then loud, then low again. Natalie had to keep working her jaw and swallowing to pop her ears. She'd never felt anything like it before, and she was scared. It hadn't been like this the whole day. Natalie and her mother had finished their storm prep soon after Maria Martinez had called Ruben the big one. But that still left hours before the hurricane actually hit. They couldn't go anywhere with the windows boarded up and the door blocked with a mattress. And since the power was bound to go out, it made sense to finish off anything in the freezer that was going to melt or spoil. So while Ruben bore down on Miami, Natalie, Mama, and Tia Beatriz settled on the couch to eat ice cream and watch telenovelas. It had almost been like a party. But now, the party was definitely over. Thunder boomed close by, shaking the whole house. Churro had been whimpering and quivering for the last hour, and now he threw up. Natalie was no fan of the mean little dog, but she felt sorry for him. She felt sick, too. They had repaired their roof after Irma, made it more secure. But Ruben was stronger than Irma had been, and was going to hit them dead on. What if Ruben ripped their roof off again, and they were swept away into the storm? Something crashed into the side of the house, and Natalie flinched. Was it a tree branch? A trash can? There was no way to look outside to see. Natalie couldn't check the rain and wind gauges she had mounted outside her boarded-up bedroom window either. Greenish-yellow lightning flashed around the edges of the plywood boards they'd put up. And, boom, the electricity went out for good. Natalie jumped. It always scared her when the lights went out in a storm. But she quickly got over it and helped her mom light a handful of small votive candles. Natalie's phone lit up with a text, and she unplugged it from the wall charger. No use keeping it plugged in now. "This storm looks so cool from up here," Shannon wrote, and she sent a picture of palm trees below bending over sideways in the wind. "It's pretty bad here," Natalie wrote back. "We just lost power." Shannon replied with a sad face emoji. Rain lashed the house, and thunder boomed again. Tia Beatriz crossed herself. "Reminds me of Hurricane Joan," she said, her thin voice barely audible over the storm. "Came straight across Nicaragua in 1988. Wiped out all the trees and farms, washed away all the roads and bridges, destroyed everybody's houses. Joan came just as the Civil War was ending, when we already had next to nothing. There was no government to aid us, so we shared what we had with each other. It helped, but it wasn't enough. So I came here, to El Norte. I miss some of the way things were before, but now my children are better off than I ever was." Natalie went to sit beside Tia Beatriz and put her arm around her. The walls rattled and shook. Natalie closed her eyes and tried to picture herself somewhere calm and sunny and safe. Someplace like Mariposa. Mariposa! She'd forgotten to save Mariposa. "I'll be right back," Natalie cried, and she grabbed a flashlight and ran for her bedroom. Mariposa. Natalie opened her bedroom closet door and pushed aside her hanging dresses and jackets. On the floor at the back, her flashlight found a stack of shoeboxes covered in glitter and bright paint. Mariposa. Natalie lifted the boxes and carried them carefully to her bed. She felt a pang of guilt for forgetting to rescue them earlier. The truth was, she hadn't thought about Mariposa in a long time. Mariposa was the fictional country Natalie had invented when she was in 3rd grade. The Kingdom of Mariposa had started as drawings and maps and stories from her imagination. But soon, she began to see her real-life neighborhood through its lens, transforming the everyday into the fantastic. The dirty canal along Okeechobee Road became the sparkling blue Mariposa River. The old Coralstone Water Sanitation Building with its arched walkways and terracotta roof was a royal castle. The small park where people walked their dogs was Mariposa's rural countryside. Natalie glanced around her bedroom. Before her walls had been covered with posters of lightning storms and Greta Thunberg and K-pop bands, they had been covered with all things Mariposa. Natalie had spent hours turning the crinkly checkerboard wrappers from food trucks into mariposa money, cutting and coloring the thin cardboard from cereal boxes to make mariposa passports for her friends and family, writing a mariposa constitution and drawing up maps with provinces and states and territories. Natalie sat on her bed and ran her hand across the blue construction paper butterfly glued to one of the shoeboxes. Mariposa meant butterfly in Spanish, and emblazoned on every piece of money, every official proclamation, on the very flag of Mariposa itself, was a Miami blue butterfly. Natalie felt bad for forgetting Mariposa. But she wasn't a kid anymore. She was in 7th grade. She couldn't keep believing in fairy tales. Still, Mariposa had meant so much to her once, and she didn't want to lose it forever. Natalie stood on her desk chair and put the Mariposa boxes up as high as she could on her bookcase, higher up than her laptop, where her memories would be safest from a flood. The house shuddered, and Natalie quailed. Outside, Reuben raged. Natalie shone her flashlight along the seam of the roof, looking for cracks. Nothing. Yet. Natalie hurried back to the living room to huddle with her mother and Tia Beatriz on the couch. "I got a message from your father," Mama said, holding up her phone. "He's all right." Natalie nodded. She was glad her dad was safe, but she didn't know him very well. Her parents had gotten divorced when she was a baby, and Natalie had only met her father twice in her life. She knew how hard it was for everyone in Puerto Rico right now, though. They still hadn't completely recovered from Hurricane Maria, which had hit Puerto Rico the same year Irma hit South Florida. Natalie's phone dinged. It was another text from Shannon. "There goes Halloween, I guess. And after all the work we did on our costumes." Natalie had totally forgotten about Halloween. She and Shannon were going to go as a pair. Shannon as a hurricane, and Natalie as Maria Martinez reporting from the storm, complete with blowing newspapers pinned to her windbreaker and an inside-out umbrella over her shoulder. Natalie smiled at the thought of their costumes, then frowned. That was what Shannon was thinking about now, while Natalie was watching to see if her roof was going to blow off. Natalie's fingers hovered over her phone as she thought about how to respond. She wanted to say that she had bigger things to worry about, but she didn't want to offend her friend. "Turning off my phone to save the battery," she wrote instead. Crash! Everyone jumped at the sound, and a blast of wind blew the mattress in front of the door down. The storm had smashed the little window above the door. Natalie and her mother dodged the broken glass on the floor and tried to right the mattress, but a river of brown water started gushing in under the door, flooding the room. "We have to stop the water!" Natalie yelled, but her mother couldn't hear her. The wind whistled like a freight train's horn outside. Wah! Wah! It was the loudest thing Natalie had ever heard, and she had to cover her ears. Natalie ran to the bathroom for towels, but when she got back to the front door, there were already 2 inches of water on the floor. She watched in horror as the ceiling wobbled and the walls rippled like waves. No, not the roof, Natalie thought. Not again. As she was looking up, as she was praying the roof wouldn't lift off and go flying away again, the back wall of her house came crashing in. The ocean comes to Hialeah. A chest-high wall of gray water swept into the house and lifted Natalie off her feet. She banged into the coffee table, swallowed salty water, and was dragged along the floor until she finally fought her way to the surface, choking and spitting. It was too much. Everything was coming at her at once. The water pulled her under again and hammered her with parts of the wall, the table, all the things they'd put up high to keep dry. Natalie was sinking, drowning, Suddenly, Reuben pulled back, like a fighter dancing away after delivering a punch, and Natalie pushed herself up against the front wall, half in, half out of the water. She spluttered and coughed, her throat raw. Her arms and legs ached. "Mama?" Natalie croaked. "Mama?" Her words were immediately eaten up by the freight train roar of the storm. Natalie had lost her flashlight and her phone in the flood, and the candles had drowned with everything else. It was pitch black in the house, except for the blinding flashes of lightning she could see outside through the missing wall. The back wall of our house got knocked down by a wave, Natalie thought wildly. That wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't like they lived by the beach. Hialeah was miles from the coast. But the water was just over her knees now, and it rose and fell with the swell of the storm, like when she went to the ocean and waded out into the waves. Only now, the ocean had come to her. Natalie's mother burst up out of the water beside her, gasping for breath, and Natalie grabbed her. It was hard for Natalie to stand, to keep her feet planted in the shifting water, but she braced her legs and held her mother up as she coughed and spat and retched. Mama clutched at her arm and pulled her close. "Tia Beatriz!" Mama shouted in Natalie's ear. Tia? Where was she? Natalie looked up in time to see another wave rolling into the house. It lifted the couch and the table and the television console and threw them against Natalie and her mother, slamming them into the wall. Natalie saw stars as pain shot through her, and she fought to stay conscious. The waterlogged mattress knocked her under again, and Natalie's scream was swallowed by another mouthful of warm, salty water. Natalie fought her way back up again and found Mama beside her, coughing and gagging but all right. And there was Churro too, clinging to the sofa. The little dog was still alive. The sofa was upside down, and Churro stood on top of it, barking his head off as though the couch had personally attacked him. Natalie still didn't see Tia Beatriz, and she suddenly wondered if Churro was trying to tell them something. She pulled Churro off the sofa and flipped it over, and up floated Tia Beatriz. "No, Tia!" Natalie cried. But the old woman didn't respond. Tia's eyes were closed, and Natalie couldn't tell if she was breathing. Natalie put Churro back on the sofa and waved frantically for her mother to come and help. Natalie slipped her arms under Tia's armpits, but she'd only managed to get her neighbor's head above water before the next wave hit, pushing them all into the front wall again. Natalie's mother swam over and took Tia Beatriz from her. Natalie didn't want to let Tia go. She couldn't bear the thought of Tia being dead, and she had to look away from the old woman's slack, ashen face. "Try to open the front door," Mama yelled over the roar of the storm. Natalie nodded, ready to do anything that might help. She unlocked the door and tried to pull it open, but the rising water held it shut. No, 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 Natalie thought. She tried the windows next, but she and her mother had boarded them all shut from the outside, trying to keep the hurricane out. She banged a fist against the plywood. How could they have known Reuben would come in through the back wall instead? Churro barked angrily. "Rawr, rawr, 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 rawr. Rawr, 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 rawr." Like he could scare the hurricane back out to sea. But Reuben wasn't going away. The water was getting higher. Furniture from their own house crowded them, joined by a lawn chair, a small metal table, and a plastic bag full of trash swept in from outside. A whole bush crashed into Natalie and clawed at her face. Natalie tried pushing past it all and escaping through the open wall at the back, but the storm surge was too strong. They were trapped, and if the water kept rising like this, they were all going to drown. Into the storm. Mama pointed to the little window up above the door, the only one they hadn't boarded up, and Natalie understood at once. It was just big enough for her to wiggle through, if she could reach it. Natalie climbed the moving stack of furniture and debris under the window. The pile shifted underneath her, but the next wave lifted her high enough to reach the windowsill. She grabbed on and pulled herself up. Arms burning, stomach scraping over broken glass, Natalie wriggled out headfirst into the storm. She worried about the fall to the steps outside, but the water was just as high outside as in. She splashed down backward, like doing a flip into a pool. Natalie was an excellent swimmer, but nothing had prepared her for diving into a hurricane. The dark, swirling water pushed and pulled at her. Rain lashed her face. Wind howled in her ears. Lightning blinded her. Little bits of things flew into her. Plants? Rocks? Parts of houses? She wasn't sure. Couldn't know. Natalie felt her panic rising. The water was up to her chest now, and she could barely stand. She tried to push her front door open from outside, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled at the plywood on the windows, but they'd done too good a job. The boards were nailed tight. Natalie grabbed the sill of the high window from the outside and pulled herself up. Easier now that the water was higher, and saw her mother's frightened face. Mama's arms were wrapped around Thea, who still wasn't awake. "Mama, I can't get the boards off," Natalie cried. But Reuben swallowed her words. Natalie's mother started to tell her something, but another wave came through the back of the house, and Mama and Tia Beatriz went underwater again. "No!" Natalie cried. She hung onto the windowsill for a long moment, waiting with growing despair for her mother to resurface. Her mother came up spluttering at last, struggling to keep herself and Tia Beatriz above water. The storm surge was taller than they were now. "Climb out through the window!" Natalie yelled. Natalie's mother shook her head. They both knew she wouldn't fit, and neither would Tia Beatriz. Mama and Tia Beatriz went under in another wave, and Natalie felt herself being pulled away from the house. She clung desperately to the windowsill, barely managing to hang on. The water had risen so much that Natalie couldn't feel the ground underneath her anymore. She was treading water now, completely at Reuben's mercy. Inside the house, Natalie's mother was sinking under the weight of Thea, whose face was the only thing above water. Natalie tried to crawl back inside, but her mother waved her off. "Don't!" her mother yelled. "You'll be trapped!" Mama handed Churro out through the window instead. The little dog was barking, always barking, but Natalie took him in her right hand and held him close to her chest, up out of the water. Mama pointed away from the house. "Go," her mouth said. "Get out of the storm!" Natalie shook her head, the driving rain mixing with her tears. "No!" she cried. "I won't leave you!" But then another wave came and lifted her, and her hand slipped from the windowsill. "No!" Natalie cried again, swallowing another mouthful of the foul water. She tumbled and turned, trying to stay upright, trying to keep herself and the little dog from drowning. "I love you, mija!" her mother yelled. Or at least, that's what Natalie thought she heard as she and Churro were swept away down the street.